What if I told you that one of the most famous facts about one of the most famous men in history is completely wrong? And what if I told you that the real story about Napoleon Bonaparte is so much weirder, so much funnier, and so much more embarrassing than anything you learned in school? Because here's the thing, Napoleon wasn't short, he really wasn't. That whole Napoleon complex idea that short guys overcompensate with aggression and ambition, it's based on a lie. But you know what is true? The Emperor of France, the conqueror of Europe, the man who made kings tremble and nations fall, once had to retreat in genuine panic from a horde of angry rabbits. Real rabbits, fluffy, long-eared, cotton-tailed bunnies. And today we're going to talk about both of these stories because honestly, history doesn't get better than this. So let's start with the big one, or rather, the small one. How did the entire world become convinced that Napoleon Bonaparte was a tiny little man? This myth has been around for over 200 years, and it's so deeply embedded in our culture that we literally named a psychological condition after it. The Napoleon complex, short man syndrome. You've heard of it. Everybody has. But where did this idea actually originate? Well, there are a few culprits, and the first and arguably biggest one is British propaganda. See, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and France were locked in one of the most intense rivalries in European history. And the British had a secret weapon that had nothing to do with cannons or warships. They had cartoonists. British caricaturists, especially a genius named James Gillray, absolutely savaged Napoleon in political cartoons. They drew him as a tiny, angry little man throwing tantrums, stomping around in oversized boots and an enormous hat. These cartoons were everywhere. They were the memes of the early 1800s. And they were devastatingly effective. People saw these images over and over, and gradually the caricature replaced reality. The fictional tiny Napoleon became more real in the public imagination than the actual man ever was. But propaganda alone doesn't explain everything. There's a second factor, and it's actually kind of a boring one. It's a unit conversion error. When Napoleon died in 1821, his height was recorded by his French physician as 5 feet 2 inches. Sounds short, right? Except those were French inches, not English inches. And here's the thing most people don't realize. The French inch, called a pouce, was longer than the English inch. A French foot had 12 pouces, but each pouce was about 2.71 centimeters compared to the English inch at 2.54 centimeters. When you do the conversion properly, Napoleon's 5'2" in French measurements comes out to roughly 5'6" or 5'7" in English measurements. And that matters a lot because it changes everything about how we understand this man's physical presence. So 5'6" or 5'7", that's not short. That's not short at all. In fact, for a Frenchman living in the late 1700s and early 1800s, that was perfectly average, maybe even slightly above average. The average height of a French male during Napoleon's lifetime was somewhere around 5'5". So Napoleon was right there in the normal range, possibly even looking down at many of his countrymen. For context, that's about the same height as the average modern French woman, sure, but compared to his contemporaries, Napoleon was a regular-sized guy. Now here's something interesting. Napoleon was often surrounded by his imperial guard, an elite unit of soldiers who had a minimum height requirement. These guys were tall. They were selected partly for their imposing physical presence. So when people saw Napoleon standing next to his guards, he looked shorter by comparison. It wasn't that Napoleon was small. It was that his bodyguards were huge. That's like standing next to an NBA team and having someone call you short. It's all relative. There's also the nickname issue. Napoleon was sometimes called Le Petit Caporal, which translates to the Little Corporal. English speakers heard this and assumed it was a reference to his height. But it wasn't. It was a term of endearment from his soldiers. It referred to his rank early in his career and expressed affection, the way you might call someone buddy or little guy as a nickname without literally meaning they're small. His troops loved him, and the nickname reflected camaraderie, not a height measurement. So the myth is busted. Napoleon was average height for his time, the victim of enemy propaganda, a unit conversion error, and a misunderstood nickname. But honestly, that's the boring revelation. Because now we need to talk about what actually happened to Napoleon that he probably wished the world would forget. We need to talk about the rabbits. It's July 1807. Napoleon has just signed the treaties of Tilsit, a pair of agreements that essentially ended the War of the Fourth Coalition and cemented France's dominance over continental Europe. This is Napoleon at the peak of his power. He has crushed the Prussians. He has forced the Russian Tsar Alexander I to the negotiating table. He is, without exaggeration, the most powerful man in the Western world. And to celebrate this monumental diplomatic triumph, Napoleon decides to throw a party. Specifically, he organizes a grand rabbit hunt for his officers and dignitaries. Now, hunting was a classic aristocratic pastime. This was how powerful men celebrated and bonded. It was refined, dignified, and projected exactly the kind of imperial majesty that Napoleon loved to cultivate. He tasked his chief of staff, Louis-Alexandre Berthier, with organizing the event. Berthier, wanting everything to be perfect for the emperor, went all out. He acquired a massive number of rabbits for the hunt. Estimates vary, but most historians put the number somewhere between hundreds and as many as 3,000 rabbits. These animals were gathered, caged, and brought to the hunting grounds, ready to be released so that Napoleon and his men could enjoy a leisurely afternoon of sport. What could possibly go wrong? Everything went wrong. And it went wrong almost immediately. When the cages were opened and the rabbits were released, the hunting party expected the animals to scatter into the fields, running for cover as any sensible wild rabbit would do. But these rabbits did not scatter. These rabbits did not run away. Instead, they turned and charged directly at Napoleon and his men. Now, to understand why this happened, you need to know one critical detail. Berthier had made a mistake, a big one. Instead of procuring wild rabbits, which would have been properly terrified of humans, he had purchased domesticated rabbits. Tame rabbits, farm rabbits, and domesticated rabbits don't fear people. They associate people with food. So when the cages opened, hundreds upon hundreds of hungry rabbits looked out, saw a large group of humans, and thought one thing. Dinner time, the rabbits swarmed. They came from every direction. They poured across the field like a fuzzy, floppy-eared tidal wave. Imagine being Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, the terror of Europe, and watching a wall of bunnies hopping toward you at full speed with absolutely no intention of stopping. At first, it was probably funny. Napoleon and his men likely laughed. They tried to shoo the rabbits away. Officers swatted at them with riding crops. Attendants tried to chase them off. But the rabbits would not be deterred. They kept coming. They swarmed around Napoleon's legs. They climbed up his jacket. They were everywhere, and they were relentless in their single-minded pursuit of what they were certain was going to be a meal. The situation escalated from amusing to genuinely chaotic. Napoleon, the man who had faced down cannon fire at the Battle of Austerlitz, who had crossed the Alps, who had stared death in the face more times than most people could count, was forced to retreat. He fled toward his carriage, swatting rabbits off his person as he went. His guards tried to help, beating back the furry onslaught, but it was no use. The rabbits divided into flanking groups, some circling around to cut off the retreat like a tiny, adorable military maneuver. Even as Napoleon climbed into his carriage and the horses started moving, rabbits reportedly leapt up onto the carriage itself, unwilling to abandon their pursuit of the emperor. Napoleon rode away from the field in what can only be described as a full tactical withdrawal. Not from the Russians, not from the British, from rabbits. Unsurprisingly, this incident did not make it into Napoleon's official memoirs. There was no triumphant painting commissioned to commemorate the day the emperor fled from bunnies. But the story survived through the accounts of those who were there, and historians have confirmed it as a real event. And honestly, I think this story matters beyond just being hilarious. It tells us something important about history and about how we remember powerful people. We tend to mythologize leaders. We make them into giants or villains, heroes or monsters. Napoleon has been all of those things, depending on who's telling the story. But the rabbit incident reminds us that even the most powerful people in history were still just people. They had embarrassing days. They had moments where nothing went according to plan. They had to run away from bunnies. The height myth and the rabbit story are actually connected in a deeper way, too. Both are about the gap between image and reality. The British created a false image of Napoleon as a tiny, insecure man, and that fiction endured for centuries. Meanwhile, the real Napoleon had a genuinely embarrassing moment that reveals his humanity, and that story nearly disappeared. We remembered the lie and forgot the truth. And that happens all the time in history. The stories that survive aren't always the ones that are accurate. They're the ones that are useful, or entertaining, or politically convenient. So the next time someone mentions Napoleon being short, you can correct them. And then you can tell them about the rabbits, which is a way better story in every possible way. And that is the incredible true story of how Napoleon Bonaparte was not short, but he absolutely 100% was attacked by rabbits. History is full of stories like this, moments that are stranger and funnier and more human than anything you'd find in a textbook, and I want to keep bringing them to you. So if you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. It really does help the channel more than you know. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new video. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What's the weirdest historical fact you know? What myth would you like to see debunked next? Drop it down below because your suggestions might just become the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.